Did you know that Spotlight On is completely self-funded by the team that produces it? We're looking for ways to keep the podcast self-sufficient without sacrificing the listener experience or the integrity of the show. The best way we could think of was to ask for the support of our listeners. Please consider making a donation to help cover our annual operating expenses. Go to spotlightonpodcast.com and click the word donate. If you can, please do. And if you cannot, please continue to enjoy the show. We're happy to have you as a listener. Thanks. Hello and welcome to Spotlight On, the podcast featuring musicians, writers, innovators, and ideas shaping music, arts, entertainment, and culture. I'm your host, Lawrence Purrier. Today, the spotlight shines on percussionist and drummer Lisa Pegher. Lisa turns percussion into something you've never heard before. A pioneering artist who moves easily between classical concert halls and electronic music spaces, Lisa wields everything from traditional drums to cutting-edge AI technology. She's performed with major orchestras worldwide and premiered works by today's leading composers. But what sets Lisa apart is her drive to push percussion into new territory. Her project, A.I.RE, takes us on a journey through the evolution of rhythm itself, from pure acoustic sounds to an AI-generated musical landscape. With composers from New York's ICEBERG collective, Lisa has crafted a show that asks big questions about music's future while delivering an unforgettable live experience. So now, percussionist and innovator, Lisa Pegher. I want to start a little bit at the beginning. Could you talk about your early relationship with percussion and sort of what drew you to that particular form of expression?
Sure. I always like to say to people when they ask me that question that percussion chose me. Interestingly enough, if I had to pinpoint how I got into it, somebody handed me a pair of sticks one day, and those sticks just ended up like becoming part of me. I don't even remember who it was, but it was like a family friend or something. It was like, oh, it was a party, hand the little kid a pair of sticks. And I felt as if I had already known how to use them in a way. And so I just started playing around. I think the first instance of performing was really just like getting behind a drum set and playing. And then as I got into it early on, I think that I was kind of just drawn to it. And it wasn't necessarily a thing where it was an immediate, oh, I think I'm going to be a drummer when I was 7, but I was drawn to just playing with the sticks all the time. So I started playing wherever I could. And then eventually when I got into, I think like grade school and I was exposed to different types of instruments, that's when the teacher there saw that I had some kind of talent and tried to draw me towards playing percussion. And ever since then, I just started practicing a lot and knowing that was what I wanted to do.
Did you have a typical drum education? Did you start with the drum pad? Did you work on grip and all that stuff?
Yes. So I think that I was fortunate in that I ended up getting a very good teacher who emphasized the importance of having a really good technique, because I think that can go two ways. You can either have gotten yourself in with a very good mentor whenever you're really young who's teaching you the right way, or you can get in with a mentor who's teaching you the wrong way and learning bad technique. I was fortunate enough to get in with one of the best teachers who had like a long lineage of studying with great teachers in the area where I grew up. And it was very much like I like to say it was like the Karate Kid, in that you had to pass one phase to get to the next. So it was very disciplined, and it was a very disciplined practice. And the teacher taught all of his students the same way. It didn't matter who you were. It was like you had to pass these different gates in order to get to the next phase. And that meant perfecting a specific technique and then moving on to, once you got past one hurdle on a technique, it was, okay, now you can learn this type of drum music, like rope drumming, snare drum. So I started out really with a basic, this is your technique. This is your main instrument that you have to learn your technique from, and everything else expands from that. And so once you get past that gate, okay, now that your technique is down, let's introduce you to another type of percussion instrument. And then it was like, let's talk about keyboard instruments after you've already mastered snare drum, drum set, and the main core of what percussion instruments are. And it was only once you pass that technique gate, and once you kind of like gotten to a certain point, reading music and all of those things, then you move into the other types of percussion instruments. And so it was very much like an everyday practice type of teaching, which I'm very grateful that that was how I ended up getting into music versus, like I said, some people just like bounce from teacher to teacher, maybe pick up different types of techniques, don't really necessarily have anything to grab onto. But that core teaching really, I think, also lent itself to everything else in life in a way. It's like learning the importance of a technique in that way on anything. Looking back on it, I'm like, well, you could say that about anything that you're learning if you really focus on how to do the essence of the thing first. It can make everything else much easier. It doesn't matter if you're becoming really good at baking bread, like painting, all these different types of arts that you can do. It really comes down to really getting that foundation solid, and everything else, if you can get past that discipline part, makes the rest of it easy eventually.
How long did your formal training or formal studies last?
I like to say that I'm a forever student. Like, I never stop learning. There's always more things to learn. And also, formal is, what is formal? Formal might mean something as simple as, when did you stop studying with a mentor? Basically, whenever I got out of college. And then there was more of a transition phase in there where you're in college and you become the teacher, you start teaching other people. And there's just a natural transition that happens, I think. But as far as learning, I don't think that ever stops. And if it does, then I feel like it's time to learn something else,
Yeah. At what point did you have I don't know if it's concept or realization or desire to bring the percussion to the front of the stage and to sort of reconceptualize the role of percussion in your own practice, your own performance, your own creativity?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking it. When I got into playing percussion, I grew up in a very kind of like rural, remote area. And for better or worse, we didn't have exposure to a symphony orchestra when I was just starting out. I think that my path may have been very different if we did, but who knows? Fate is fate. But what ended up happening was I got into percussion, but I've always felt, from the first time that I started playing the drums, I always felt and heard and played them as if they were like melodic instruments. It was just natural to me to hear and play drums that way. It was only when I got exposed to it more in different types and genres of music where I realized that there's the opposite of that, where people consider drums as just like as loud as you can play, as fast as you can play. That's how you are determined if you're good or not. But to me, I love melodies, singing, and expressiveness in that type of way. And so when I got into playing drums, I was almost taken back that there was like, everybody just assumed when I said that I played the drums that, like how fast and loud can you play? And I was thinking, I would rather compare myself to the violinist than somebody who's just like trying to see how fast and loud they can play. When I started to realize that was really where I felt like I could make an impact in percussion, was like really leaning into how I hear percussion. That's when I started to search, like, well, how could I actually do this? Luckily, I got into one of the youth symphonies in the area and started to realize, wow, there's soloists that play in front of the stage, these concertos and things, but most of them are violinists or pianists, which again, I was like, I'm very drawn to that melodic like sense of things. And I was like, why don't people hear percussion that way? Like, why can't we have percussionists standing up there and playing all the percussion pieces like beautifully and melodically in the same way that these other soloists are playing concertos? And so that's when I kind of had the shift of, maybe this is somewhere where I could make an impact and start to bring percussion to the front of the stage. Very quickly, I realized that it was a very big task, a very big effort. And
because of lack of repertoire or lack of audience acceptance, or
both. I mean, lack of repertoire, lack of areas where I could actually expose the repertoire that did exist. Like, most of the competitions wouldn't even allow percussionists to join. Like a lot of those, I had to almost beg and plead for them to hear a percussionist. I had to get some of my piano friends to write transcriptions of these concertos, piano transcriptions, so that I could take them to some of these concerto competitions early on. An uphill battle to even get presented in that way.
Mm.
Within that time frame, it didn't matter to me because ignorance is bliss in a way. And I just knew what I heard in my head and I knew what I wanted to do at that time. And so I was just striving for my dreams and my goals. But then I also realized maybe there are other avenues for this as well. And that's when I started to get into creating my own recital type shows to take into places. And this almost happened naturally where I come up with these like themes of things in my head and like start to consider how I could create a show around a specific type of theme. Oftentimes in my life, I think it naturally evolves from wherever I am in my evolution of life. It's like, artistically speaking, there's some theme going along that happens to be a good artistic palette that I end up creating some type of percussion show around that would embody that theme. So there's kind of two angles to it. There's like the more traditional angle where I really tried to lean into the solo realm of what percussion could be in front of the stage. And then there's the themed shows of like, how could I create these like concepts based on a specific theme and bring like an entire 50 or 60-minute percussion show into like a smaller concert type setting.
Okay, that is phenomenally helpful and I think sets the stage for some of the other things I want to talk about in a moment. But one last question along the developmental lines, if I can say it that way. Can you tell me a little bit about like electricity, electronics, technology? Like when did that enter your practice? Because I'll leave it at that. I'm so curious about that element of what you do.
Yeah, so asking all the hard questions, but again, it goes back to my evolution in a way. I think that what I've noticed is that holding on to any one thing really can hold an artist back. And what I started to realize pretty early on in the classical music industry was that I didn't feel as if that was the only place for me. And in fact, I started to have a resistance towards it at one point where I thought, I don't want to just do one thing. It kind of goes back to the technique thing where it's like, once you have that solid technique, it almost is, it would inhibit you to only use that in one realm. And so what I started to feel this resistance of is that in classical music, what you're often doing is taking something that somebody made for you and trying to play that as perfectly as possible or as flawlessly as possible. And yes, putting your own stamp on it in a way, but in another essence, to me, it was holding back my own self-expression. And so that's when I started to really reach out to say, like, where is my inner artist and how can I get my own inner self-expression exposed and not feel like I'm just stuck trying to represent somebody else's thoughts and feelings. That's where I started to have that resistance in the classical music realm. I wanted to improvise. I wanted to write my own music. I wanted to create my own shows, as I told you earlier. And so during this time, electronics were creeping into the music and arts. I mean, they always have, especially in drumming. We could like point back to when drum machines started to like scare musicians. I always point back to this because there were phases where people were like, oh, live drummers aren't going to be needed anymore because we have drum machines now and those are going to take over recording sessions. And that was the first big scare. During those types of phases, as a percussionist who hears things and like a drummer who wants to create soundscapes, I'm looking at it as like a different timbre, a different type of music, a different set of paints that I can add to my palette. And I'm thinking, how can I actually get this technology integrated into the things that I'm doing? And so I started exploring different types of software and different programs where I could actually sample my own drum sounds and manipulate them somehow, and then start to trigger them live in my performances. And then also reaching out to other composers at the time and saying, hey, like instead of this traditional stuff like that a lot of people are writing, I would say, can you write me something that mixes electronics with acoustic percussion? And so that was kind of the first phase of it. And so I started exploring all these different types of software programs, like how can I trigger these sounds? How can I take an existing acoustic sound and make it different than it is today? Like I was really interested in the beginning of just taking analog sounds and mixing them with anything else that would make them more unique. And so like extra sauce, extra special in a way, because what you're doing is you're taking something existing and then you're finding something else and mixing it. It's like coming up with a color that nobody else has yet.
Yeah.
So that became very interesting to me. And then I started really exploring these different software programs. And that actually led me into software engineering and programming myself, where I started to dig into the code, start to figure out how do these things actually work under the hood. And it took me into a whole other realm of things of like actually building programs that create the music itself. I leaned in heavily to that, but in the beginning, it was really just an exploration of how can I mix analog with digital and make a different type of sound. And that's opened up the whole completely different world. And it just continues to. It's like an endless way of mixing paints that never ends in a way. And that's what I really love about it.
Along those lines, could you talk to me? First of all, I want to make sure I pronounce it correctly. Is the project A.I.RE?
Yeah.
Is that the right way to say it?
That's how I say it.
Okay, good. I mean, it looks obvious, but sometimes there's the devil's in the details. Can you summarize what that project is for listeners?
So this is one of those programs that I've like a concept that came up from this evolution that I was going through in my own personal life, where I was getting heavily into technology, programming, mixing these types of analog sounds with digital sounds. And A.I.RE came out of this idea where, again, we started going through this phase of the very early. Now, this was before ChatGPT went crazy and everybody started talking about AI. This was like when it was just kind of creeping in and starting to get into the headlines a little bit. And so people were talking about like, okay, what is that? What is artificial intelligence? And it hadn't even like hit the music industry yet. I was already digging into technology at that time. And so it was at the forefront of my mind of like, how is this going to affect music? And at the same time, this collective of composers in New York City called the ICEBERG Composers Collective had reached out to me. I knew one of the composers from a different project, and they were like, they do collaborations with artists. And they were like, we want to tap you to do a collaboration. Do you have any ideas of how we could do this? The idea they said was like, we have, I can't remember how many composers in the collective. It's like 8 or 10 composers. We'll all write you a piece of music. And I'm like, okay, well, that's interesting. But I'm like, how can I make use of all of these composers in a way that makes sense? And so I immediately came up with this idea of why don't we do something focused around AI and mixing electronics, taking whatever we have in the music industry currently. Now, this was pre-pandemic when this concept came up. And let's do research, figure out like what's existing right now in the AI space in music. My task to them was each composer makes a piece of music that evolves from exactly my love of what technology and music and percussion is, So it's like a timeline, essentially. Like we have 8 composers. 1 through 8 is a timeline of analog and percussion to starting to mix electronics with percussion to just electronics, like percussion as just electronics, no acoustic or analog at all. And then the evolution of integrating artificial intelligence, which is where we are today. So it's the evolution from the roots of percussion all the way to modern day of what palette is available to us in mixing these things together. And it probably would have gone faster had we not lost 2 years of our lives from the pandemic. But by the time that was all over, that's exactly when ChatGPT hit the headlines and everybody started going wild about artificial intelligence. And here now we have this show and we're about to like actually get it presented in New York City, which was great. So the timing worked out well. And for it at least making sense as to like, yeah, this is really our now and the future of what we have available for us in percussion and music, and being able to tap these composers to get their creativity. But I also composed some of the music in that show as well. So I also got to do my own expressive points in that show as well. It's an evolution. It stands for artificial intelligence rhythm evolution. And it really is that timeline of acoustic through electronics, through mixing electronics with acoustic. And then eventually the artificial intelligence learns from all of that and can perform by itself, not just working with it, but it literally can learn from all of the things that I did in the show and make its own music without me doing anything. And that's kind of, you know, through the show, it takes us through that journey. And it also, there's a visual aspect to it too, where I have a live touch designer who takes some of those ideas and does like a live DJ of the animation with it. And then towards the end, it actually like takes my human figure and I turn into the image on the screen. And my motions are actually what is triggering the music. And then, like I said, eventually the computer is just playing things from what it learned from me within the entirety of the show. So it's not always the same. And also like the learning could be different given whatever show is happening.
That was something I wanted to ask you about is that part of the performance generative? Like basically how is the AI integrated? Because to your earlier point, you know, AI can mean a lot of different things. Like in the context of a creator's software kit, it could just be a tool that you turn on to help manipulate something you're already working on as opposed to generating fresh artistic work. You mentioned that span of time and when you first came up with the idea and started working with the collaborators and the composers. Can you recall in any specific way in that sort of roughly 2-year gap of the pandemic, how the technologies you had available changed from when you first sort of started tasking or collaborating with the composers?
Sure. It's drastic.
I would imagine.
I can hardly believe how fast the technology, I mean, we think about how long have iPhones been around? Not that long, but how much they've become integrated in everybody's lives. Geez, if you think about how long the internet has been around, it's not been that long. It's so in its infancy, but we feel like it's been around forever. And that's exactly how I felt with this technology is that when we first started out, we're digging in, we're looking for tools. There's Google Magenta was like in the headlines a little bit. There were some text to music prompts that were coming out at that time where you could write something in that was an idea and it might prompt out some pretty poorly generated song for you. Those were the early types of tools when we first started digging into it. By the time that the pandemic was over and we revisited like, okay, we're actually going to put on the show now, finally, and have the New York City world premiere, we dug back in. And not only were like all of those tools way better, the outputs were, and this points to the learning models, like how fast the learning models can actually like learn from whatever they were given previously, whether or not folks know or not. But these models that like in ChatGPT is using, a lot of them are trained on information that was happening 3 years ago. We're not even getting to the point where it's caught up to us yet as far as learning. So in 3 years from now, they'll be learned on what was happening in 2024. And that's exactly kind of what you see in the music tools as well, where it's like, okay, the generative music that's coming out the output itself is getting much, much more easy to listen to, better results, more of what you would expect, less digital sounding, the interactive things that you can set up, the tools, the software where you are actually controlling what's happening by like motions, motion detectors, connecting visual types of software with the music inputs too. All of those types of integrations are getting like way, way more easy to use. Whereas before, you would have to set up a lot of different types of integrations just to get the one thing to work. So even those are getting easier to integrate and use in those 2 years. And I can tell you that I also work on a team who builds AI software, like creator tools. And in our time frame, what we've been able to come up with and generate from our own musical libraries and our content, the results are astounding just because of how you can train the models on different things and the speed in which they're able to learn.
We'll be back with more Spotlight On and Lisa Pegher right after this break.
Hey, this is Michael, producer of Spotlight On, and I'm here to tell you about a project Lawrence and I have been working on. It's called The Tone Arm, and it's an online magazine devoted to arts, music, culture, and people who make cool stuff. Those people are mostly musicians, but they're also artists, entrepreneurs in the arts, writers, and anyone else making our world a better and more interesting place to live in. You'll find expanded articles on our podcast guests, inspiring interviews with creative folks talking about their craft, fascinating perspective pieces from our team of writers, and the latest news and releases from the artists and musicians in our orbit. We're so proud of the Tone Arm, and we can't wait for you to check it out. It's thetonearm.com. And while you're there, become a free member of the Tone Arm and add us to your RSS reader. There's lots to come. That's thetonearm.com. The Tone Arm, putting a needle on the cultural wax.
And now, back to Spotlight On. Your point about the speed of the learning is fascinating to me because just as a user of various tools and someone also with a history of using technology and being, for lack of a better word, a student of technology, I've noticed just in the last several months, like for example, with Zoom, they have this thing called the AI assistant. When I first turned it on earlier this year, it's basically a note taker. So at the end of a Zoom call, it sends you the notes from the call. It was like performance art, how silly they were. You know, it was either overly literal or it didn't really understand things. It was bad. It was just flat out bad. And this was maybe March, I started using it. By the end of May, it was like, wow, these are really useful. Now when I get them, I'm like, this is stunning. Like it's picked up nuance. It's really shocking. And that was in a very short period of time. For chatbots, I use Claude, and I just like his personality. And it's amazing. They released an update last week, and I was using Claude before I knew last week that the update had come out. And I emailed my collaborator on this project and I said, have you noticed that Cloud changed today? Like Cloud's behaving much more intuitive today. And like, he's asking me questions before he starts the tasks. Like something happened with Cloud today. And then we saw there was an announcement that they updated the model, but it's really fascinating. And your point about what the models are trained on, I would have to think that to be in the labs within these companies, it seems 100% clear to me that they have real-time versions of the models, like that there are playpens where there are much more capabilities than what have been released or deployed yet for a variety of reasons. But it's got to be shocking to see some of like the bleeding edge versions of the models.
Yes. And we're not fully prepared for it, which is why we can only keep the guardrails on for so long. And that's, I say this in a lot of interviews when I get a chance to talk about this stuff, is that there's always the bright side and the dark side of things. And we haven't you could talk to the people who are really deep in these learning chambers and they don't know what the guardrails are.
Yeah.
And that's why with the speed of the learning, once the models can learn from each other and they don't need any human there anymore, that's when we need to come up with some kind of guardrails or at least figure out what to do in those types of situations. We can look back though. I mean, it's just like we didn't know what to do with the internet when it came out either. And to some regard, we still don't know what to do with it. And it's probably going to be the same.
What we've done with it.
Exactly.
We've only destroyed democracy.
Exactly. There's a lot of things happening where we lost control. And again, I just hope that we are able to contain what we need and it doesn't take away from human creativity, because that's my fear with it. If I have any fear on the other side of all the great things that it offers, as far as like a new creative palette, the dark side of what I see happening with people who haven't been exposed to something as like learning a technique. When you're writing music, understanding music and composition at a deep level of what it actually is, when you can just push a button and generate music and have very limited, if not zero knowledge of what any of it is, because we have a computer model that does it for us. And then just taking that as, oh, that's good enough, and losing all of that human expression. And I think that that's where the fear of it comes in from me, is that I see a sadness in it where there's so much lacking with just pushing buttons and hearing it versus really creating it from the depths of your soul. And that I hope that we don't lose that really deep, important human aspect of things. And I think the fear comes in is when people aren't exposed to anything except asking the computer a question and getting whatever it needs. It's like putting your hand out and just having somebody put something in it and never having to work or know what that feels like to really embody that deep emotional, your own DNA into something where it's like, oh,
Right.
I have an idea, push a button, put it in a prompt, and it's kind of like the McDonald's of music in a way. There is bound to be just a realm of that starts to really build up in our society. I just hope that we don't lose the other part of it as well.
It's interesting because it's hard to talk about AI without that shadow or that specter of the AGI conversation and the doomerism. And I don't mean to dismiss any of that. I'm not seeking to direct the conversation there. It's to stay in the place where we talk about the analogies to other technologies. Where it is more interesting and sort of fun to talk about is when we do look at how other technologies have been applied and embraced, right? Like to your earlier point about drum machines, there's some shitty, overproduced drum machine music or digital only music that isn't, it's not that exciting. It probably won't stand the test of time. It might be fine in the moment, but there's also work that has been beautifully crafted and has used those tools, or maybe took something that existed in the box and then modified it and edited it and used it as a source or a collaborator. Again, it's hard to say like AI can also follow that pattern because it has all these other capabilities. Like I'm not really worried about the drum machine taking over the world the same way we fret about this other stuff.
Yeah.
Working on the A.I.RE project, and given how you have to think about AI and and advanced technologies in your sort of air quotes day job, how did working on A.I.RE change your perspective, or did it challenge any assertions you had? Like basically, do you have a different perspective in any way about AI in particular, or the use of technology in general than you did when the project started?
It's an ongoing, I don't think the phase has ended quite yet. I think I'm still in it in a way. Yes, I learned a lot about the space and what can be done in the performance realm with AI tools, but it was only one themed show. I feel like I could do a whole other part two with just the advancements that have happened in the past year. I would learn a whole slew of other things incorporating these different ideas. I mean, there has to be a stopping point when you're putting on like a 60 to 90 minute show where you're like, this is the framework that we have to work in. These are the composers. This is the timeline. And within those guidelines, I think no matter what you're incorporating into music and art, and if you're speaking from your own voice, I think that that's always going to be what makes the things unique. That to me is the importance of collaboration, improvisation, and expressiveness in art and music itself.
Yeah.
That process of taking all of these composers together, myself, making an idea, looking and researching these technologies, and then making it into something that we can stand up in like in front of people and present in a story type fashion. I think not only does it just like speak to how important like creating anything is, but that you can't necessarily, you can't put it in words. You can't even put it in like, I look back at these projects that I've done and I'm like, wow, they're so different from one another. You know, the last project that I did was Sci-Fi Trio. It was, you know, jazz improvisation with hip hop dancers, and based on the feelings that people have around social media and female oppression and things like that. I look at this show and it's like all about technology and embodying like the humanness and non-humanness of music right now and where we're going with those things. And I think that if I started over tomorrow and we said, we're going to put on the A.I.RE show, except the guidelines now are that we're not using any of the same technology. We're only using anything that was created from 2022 onwards, we would have different results. And it would probably have a different type of vision and feel to it. But at the same time, I think we're still in that phase right now. Like we haven't gotten out of the generative music, AI, taking what a computer can learn and making a new genre out of it. I think that's where we are right now. And what you're going to see, like you just mentioned, you were like, well, I'm not really worried about like the dooms of like AI and things because we've been in these phases before. What we'll likely see more of is AI as a genre. We'll look back on it and be like, there is some really cool art, you know, that's been like generating in the AI genre space. There might even be a named genre of like AI music in our future where this had some kind of AI incorporated in it, or it's purely AI. And I think that that's where we are now, and that's what our future is. And it's kind of exciting in a way because we haven't had a new genre in a while. You know, we haven't had a completely new palette to work from. And I think that we really do have that right now.
Yeah, I think where I have the freedom to lose a lot of the doomerism or where I get most excited is when I talk to artists about the tools, because, you know, for as many different artists there are that are dabbling with the technologies, there's as many different points of view and outputs. And that part's really exciting to see what an artist does with this. It's no different than giving an artist any new tool, any new technology to play with. They're going to do things that are much more interesting than what a tech oligarch is going to do or a product development group is going to do. So,
Exactly.
yeah. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about circuits and skins. As a listener, it's another piece that, and you know, you can tell me I'm completely wrong, by the way. I'm just sharing an impression with you. It's where I also perceived a sense of narrative, much like what you talked about with A.I.R.E. You know, it's, I don't know, 25 minutes or so worth of music across a few movements. There is a movement to it. There seems to be a narrative flow. And I wonder, could you just talk about that journey? Is it there? And if so, what is it to you?
Totally. Thank you for listening to it. It is to date, I would say, I don't like to say things are my favorite, but up to date, I've commissioned and premiered a lot of concertos, but I really love this concerto. And the reason why is because I do feel like it has the narrative of, again, what it is to work in a collaborative space with an idea and then take that idea and actually bring it into fruition.
Yeah.
And so working with Paul, I actually went to Paul at one point and said, hey, I want a concerto that has electronics and percussion because, again, I'm in this phase, right? And I want to bring percussion to the front of the stage. But what I also want to do is bring new types of audiences and different types of people into classical orchestra halls. that has always been one of my big passions. I'm like, well, if we don't start bringing people who like different types of music into concert halls, we're losing out. We're not opening, we're saying like, this is only accessible to a certain type of listener. And I really think that mixing genres and bringing different types of audiences in is going to be the answer to getting people excited about classical music again, because it doesn't just have to be classical. It can be classical modern. It can be concertos like Circuits and Skins. It has to have some kind of thing that reaches out and speaks to a broader audience. And so when I went to Paul, I was like, I really want a concerto that is electronics and percussion, but has some kind of like almost like a DJ element to it, where it's like accessible to audiences, fun to listen to, but also mixes some other genre. And what I said was EDM, which is electronic dance music. So Paul is actually a professor at one of the universities in Michigan, and he teaches electronic music. So it was like a great collaboration, and he was all for it because he listens to Diplo, and like, you know, he's like teaching his students at the university how to write like Diplo and deadmau5 and all of this. I'm like, that's what I want. I want to mix percussion and take that into the classical orchestra hall. So he wrote Circuits and Skins. And again, some of these things, I feel like we create them and it's not time for them yet. We did a first iteration of it. Audiences love it. I don't know that just yet the orchestra halls are ready for it or understand it. But that doesn't mean that it's not going to happen. I almost feel like now is the time. It's like manifesting itself as like, all of this thing is happening in our society. Circuits and Skins is exactly the embodiment of this. And people are hungry for something different. There's a certain amount of people who will go to the symphony orchestra because they want to hear Beethoven. But I think there's the younger generations want to go in and hear something that they can relate to a little bit better. And that's what we're trying to do with this type of music and this type of concerto. So back to your point, though, the journey itself is almost like the idea and vision that I had for the piece itself. And then Paul's experience with not only just teaching electronic dance music, but also going to EDM festivals. And again, this was my dream for classical music, where it's like, I want the same excitement for people to come to a classical music concert that they do when they go to an EDM festival. Because you look at these festivals and it's just like hundreds of thousands of people show up and they love it. And they're so happy to be there. And so Paul had gone to one of these festivals called Northern Nights, and I think it's in California or something. And so he was writing from a perspective of his journey at one of these EDM festivals. And then as he brought it to me, he opened up the palette and said, Lisa, most of the music in there is improv. Like a lot of the stuff that I'm playing are long sections of music where I had the artistic freedom to improvise and decide what was going to be in that concerto. So from some of the drum rhythms to when I break down into the electronic patch on the vibraphone, I'm improvising that whole cadenza right there. The journey into the reason why the concerto goes, it segues, it doesn't really have any space in between, is because it's supposed to feel like you're at an EDM concert where it's like you're going
more like a set.
Exactly. Like you're in a set and it's going from one thing to another and it builds up. It goes from, you're kind of in this forest phase where it's like more of very similar. You're right. Like to A.I.RE, where it's like, it starts out with the roots, the nature aspect of it, like in the forest, everybody's like gathering together. You have nature there. Then I start to break into the EDM patches with the drum pads and the triggers, and then bringing in the acoustic vibraphone stuff within that palette. That leads into the middle movement, which is like the most like drummy, hardcore part of it. And then we get into the last part, which is called All the Lights, which in the show, we do have the multimedia aspect of it too, which literally is like me going in as if I was like deadmau5 on stage or Amon Tobin or somebody like up there triggering things on my drum set and my drum pad with all the lights happening. And so whether or not this dream of ours and mine takes off the way that I wanted to is, not really up to me. It's fate and the way life evolves and manifests. But that is the journey, and that's the journey that I'm on. I think oftentimes I have to go back. I think a lot of artists struggle with this, but one of my favorite writers is Thich Nhat Hanh, and he wrote in one of these books called The Art of Power, which the title isn't what you think. It really talks about almost like the opposite of power. Like power doesn't come from any of these things in our society that like you think that they do. It really just comes from being human, and that life really is happening and we are just beings in it. And being able to accept those things is part of like really coming into true power.
Yeah.
He compares one of like, it was either, I think it was to Leonardo da Vinci or one of these really famous artists, and said, you can look back in history and see where some artists got very depressed and upset because they had this vision and dream and it didn't necessarily go the way that they wanted it to. And then they end up committing suicide or like, really taking it to heart. But on the other side of that is realizing that you're here to bring those things, whether or not it's time for them or not, is not necessarily up to you. And if you can lean into that, that's where you can continue to keep learning and keep making art. Because if you're not focused on the result and you're always focused on the path, that's where the real magic is, that makes you able to continue on whether or not everybody else is ready for it or not.
Yeah. It really strikes me, while you were speaking, I was thinking about the way like Mahler would have been perceived 125 years ago, whatever it was now, or more broadly, like when atonality started to creep into classical music, and how audiences were either incredibly alienated and like outraged by it, or some segment of the audience completely just enraptured and excited by it. But also that there was a time when the concert halls, when there would be a premiere or a debut, people would come from around the world, and go to Vienna, and it would be exciting it would be a place to go, not just Europeans, like people would come from around the world to be seen, and it was a place to go. It was important cultural, pop culture almost, to be there. And so I don't think it's far-fetched to think that just because that connection with the music was lost in parts of the 20th century, not even really big parts, right? I think like Leonard Bernstein, like you couldn't ask for a more pop culture figure in the mid-century in classical. I mean, it feels like it's not a pipe dream, those things you talk about, and they're not outside the tradition. It's reconnecting with that. You mentioned the feeling of a festival in the concert hall. Have you thought at all about, could you present this music at a festival? I mean, it seems to me like that audience would be open-minded to it, and it would be very powerful.
Yes, I have. And I wish it was as easy as just thinking it and saying it, because Paul and I are both like, yeah, we should do it at South by Southwest. We should take it to the Northern Nights Festival. And in fact, even the Northern Nights Festival, they're like, yeah, this is like a cool idea. But actually getting it programmed and on the books is a much more difficult task for some reason. But to answer your question, yes, I think that there's two realms of that. One is exactly what you're just talking about. Okay, there was a time when a premiere would happen and, the classical concert halls, and people would come and know about it and show up to it because that was part of an exciting thing to do. That's really what I'm striving for, is that I feel like our culture is still doing that, but they're doing it at festivals and EDM shows. What I'm do is see if we could reverse it back to say, look, the reason why we're shutting people out of some of these other avenues today is because it's not accessible in the same way that these festivals are. So we must break down the barriers on both sides, right? And be like, I do think that getting onto like an EDM festival or something like that, it's in the middle. It's like, we could do it both ways. I think both ways would benefit from it. It's like, okay, take something like this to a South by Southwest festival. Take something like this to any of the Masterwork series at these classical music concerts. It's all about reaching into the different people who want and are hungry for it and are going to be positively inspired and affected by it whenever it's put in front of them. I mean, I like to say, and it's true, that oftentimes people don't know what they want until you show it to them. We're not showing it to them, and we're not even open to putting something different and showing it to them. How are we going to know if it's something that people want? And that's where, I wake up every day and I'll just keep trying.
Thank you so much, Lisa Pegher, and as always, thank you for listening to Spotlight On. Spotlight On is executive produced and hosted by me, Lawrence Purrier. We're produced and marketed by Michael Donaldson. Editing and sound design is by Terry Grant. Our theme music is by Q-Burn's Abstract Message. The most important member of our team is you. Thank you for supporting our work. Now, please rate and review us wherever you listen to podcasts, and then visit us online at spotlightonpodcast.com. There you'll find our free episode archive, our online store, and a link to make a donation to support our work. Thanks for listening, be safe, and stay in touch.